for volunteering to sew one of our fabric gowns. We're making a video to kind of show you some of the steps to go through it since we don't have an actual pattern. So the finished gown is going to look like this. This is the front of it. We have the back. The back is open. We'll be adding 2 cotton twill ties on, and we'll be adding a cotton twill tie to the side. And so the next step is I'll show you what you're going to get in your packet. You're going to receive in your packet basically a large rectangle piece of fabric. It's either going to be from this width, 55 inches or 65 inches, because we're making 2 sizes. And the length would be from the top here down to the bottom, and that's going to be somewhere between 40 and 45 inches. So the first step that you're going to do is, we're using all donated fabric, so we're trying to be as conservative as possible, and we are getting donated sheets, which are actually great. This particular piece of fabric was a donated sheet, so this side is already sewn. The hem is already sewn of the gown. So on this rectangle, I have 2 raw edge sides that I'm going to sew. So your very first step is, whatever your rectangle is, whatever raw edges you have, you want to finish those off. We don't want to have any raw edges because the nurses will be washing these daily, so they're going to get a lot of washing. And so you've got the square in your packet, and then you'll also have 2 sleeves in your packet that we'll be sewing on to this piece later. These are your 2 14-inch ties to tie the back of the gown, and that's a 62-inch tie that we'll be putting on the side. So the next step will be what we do after we finish the raw edges. So now you have finished off all the raw edges that you had on your rectangle. I did a rolled hem. I did a 1/4 inch and then folded it in again a 1/4 inch, so I wouldn't have a raw edge. You might be using again a zigzag or serge or however you did it. But we now have a rectangle with finished edges on all sides. The next step is to measure the width of your fabric and mark the center point. I mark it on the top and the bottom, because in the next step we're going to be folding both edges of the fabric over to the center point on both sides. So we fold that over to the center point on both sides. And now you're starting to see that this is the back of the gown. Again, this is the bottom, this is the hem. This is the top. The next thing we're going to do is take a ruler, measuring tape, whatever you have. You might also, so whatever you have to measure with. And mark it from this edge in 4.5 inches. And you want to do that on both sides. A step down the road, pin is going to be a stopping point where we're not going to want to sew past it. So I'll do the same thing on the other side and mark it 4.5 inches. Okay, so once you have those marked, then we're going to take your sleeve and just want to fold it in half. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the edge of the sleeve up at the top, and I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to mark the bottom of the sleeve. And you'll want to do that on both sides. And then once you have it marked, this is the fold here of your fabric. You're going to take your scissors and you're going to cut right down the fold to the pin and stop there. So you fold it back. This is going to be the portion where we're going to sew the sleeve in. So we do it on this side, and then we go ahead, we mark it there by putting our sleeve up. We again mark it with a pin, we cut it, and then we fold it back, and you kind of see now that on each side you have where the sleeve's going to go. So before we sew the sleeve in, we're going to want to put elastic on the narrower edge of the sleeve. That's going to go around the wrist to be the cuff. So what you're going to do, and again, it depends if you're using sergers to finish your seam or a zigzag or a rolled hem. I'm doing a rolled hem. So I'm going to turn this in. The main thing is, it doesn't really matter how much you turn it in as long as you have a large enough opening to get your elastic through with a safety pin. So I'm going to turn it, probably around 5/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to stitch along that seam right there. And then once I've done that, because I still have a raw edge because I'm not zigzagging or serging, I'm going to turn mine one more time. If you have a serge or zigzag, you won't have to do that. But I'm going to turn it one more time, and I'm going to stitch on that outer edge. And that's going to give me a casing to put the elastic through. In your kit, you're probably wondering, you had 2 7-inch pieces of elastic, and this is where they go. So then, once you have that casing, I'm going to put a safety pin on the end of my elastic. I'm going to thread it through this casing once I have it stitched. And when I get to, on the first part, when I get the elastic to the edge, I'm going to stop before I pull the pin the rest of the way through. And I'm going to stitch back and forth a few times, and I'm going to tack the elastic down at that end. I'm going to pull the pin through the rest of the way, and then on the other end, I'm going to stitch over the elastic to tack it down. So when I have that done, then you're gonna, on your sleeve is gonna look like this. You're gonna have the elastic in there. It's gonna be tacked down on both sides. And then in the next step, I'll show you how we're gonna sew the sleeve and the shoulder. Okay, so now we're on to the next step. You've got your elastic in both cuffs of the sleeve. You've got your sleeves pinned on to the body of the fabric. And so now the first step is we're going to stitch where you pin that sleeve on. And that's stitching, so we're kind of doing the armhole of the sleeve. And when you pinned it on, you probably noticed there's one edge that's kind of straight, and then on one edge you see that little V when you made that slit in the side of the fabric. And I like to have that V on top because we kind of have to ease the fabric around there so we don't have a big pucker. So I like it on top so I can see what I'm doing there. So we're gonna go ahead, I'm using a 5/8 inch seam. If you want to use something a little bit different, again, this isn't a part that it matters drastically. I wouldn't use one bigger than 1/2 inch because then you might end up making the sleeve a little bit too small. But anywhere up to 5/8 inches is good. So we'll get started sewing that. So now, as I get a little bit closer to that V, I just want to make sure that my fabric on the other side is smooth and flat, so I'm not sewing in any puckers in there. Making sure everything is nice and smooth there. And before I get to that little part, I'm smoothing it out a bit so I can minimize the puckering in there. So I'm kind of just flattening that all out around there. And then I'm just going around the V and then kind of straighten out the fabric again. As I come around there. And again, I'm just kind of checking my back side that things aren't puckered up there. Getting it kind of straightened out there. so now that we have that sewn, scissors somewhere around here, there they are. We'll snip that thread. I'll go ahead and pull out the pins that I didn't pull out. And then we've got that sewn on, and you can see there's going to be a little bit of a pucker, but we just try to minimize it a bit when we go slowly around that little V. And then because this is going to get a little bit more wear and tear as the nurses are moving and working with patients, and I am going to just do one more row of stitching just to kind of reinforce it. So I'll go back along the row that I stitched, and we'll just make another stitch just to give it a little extra strength and durability. And again, I still want to be paying attention that I'm not puckering anything up on the back side. So now that we have that stitch double, you'll want to go ahead and do the same thing on the next side with your sleeve, and then we'll go on to the next step, doing the shoulder and the neck. Okay, so now we have the sleeves attached to the body. So the next step is we're going to be sewing along the top part of the sleeve and the shoulder to finish up the body of the gown. So you're just taking this part, folding it up, obviously like matching the seam lines up here. And then earlier when I told you to put that pin in 4.5 inches because it was going to remind you of a stopping point. So if for some reason something happened to your pin, measure from here to here 4.5 inches and put it back in if it's not there. So that when you're sewing along here, you're going to stop here. And that's going to be your stop point. So, so go ahead and sew this part of the sleeve from your 4.5 inch mark down. Do the same thing on the other side. Yay, you're at your last step of making the gown. So we basically got the gown all sewn, and the last thing we need to do is add the ties. So lay your gown down flat, put these together, and get it all straight so that when you put on your ties, you'll have them on nicely. So gown ties in the back, so you'll just take one of your 14-inch ties and just put it in a little bit and turn the seam over, and then just stitch it down. And stitch it really good, because obviously it'll be getting tied, so it will be getting some stress on it, so maybe you'll go back 3 or 4 times just to make sure it's nice and solid. And then you'll do the same thing on the other side. And then you have your other tie, which is 62 inches. So what you'll want to do is fold that 62-inch tie in half. You'll want to measure down 18 inches and then put a pin at 18 inches right on the fold, pinning your tie down in the middle. And then again, this is going to be tied, and it is going to get a bit of stress. So, stitch back and forth 3 or 4 times, stitch in X, whatever works for you to make it nice and solid so that it won't, come off when they're tying their gown. And once you've done that, you've got your finished gown. So as you'll see here we have the gown all finished. And we've got both ties. Find the other one here. We've got both ties on the back. When they put the gown on, it ties behind the neck. And we've got the ties stitched there on the right. And the last thing is I just want to thank Gail, our RN, for coming up with this pattern to make the fabric gown, and thank you for making these for our staff.